name is David Malone, and I have the privilege of being the rector, the president, in other words, of the UN University, a body of institutes, 15 of them on all 5 major continents, and a number of programs spread elsewhere. Our headquarters is in Tokyo, and that's where we meet today with our guest, Dr. Adekeye Adebajo, who is director of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, South Africa. Ade himself is a Nigerian. He studied mainly in Britain, getting his doctorate from Oxford. He studied subsequently at Stanford, and then came to work in New York alongside the United Nations, running a very dynamic program on African issues relevant to the UN, principally peace and security issues. And it was from there that he returned to Africa to go to Cape Town. We're meeting today in Tokyo to discuss a theme he proposed, which was, in effect, the scramble for Africa after the Berlin Conference of the 1880s. But could you tell us a bit about the Berlin Conference and why it's still relevant today?
Sure. Thank you, David. The Berlin Conference was a gathering of 14, mostly European countries, and the scramble for Africa had already begun. And what happened was that the German Chancellor at the time, Otto von Bismarck, called the conference in a way to have an orderly partition of Africa so that the major European powers, imperial powers, Germany, France, Britain, mostly France and Britain, would not fight over it. But Bismarck also had the interest of keeping France busy in Africa in order to divert France from issues in Europe, for example, Alsace-Lorraine, which was still a historical scar in relations between the two of them. So that's basically the background to the Berlin Conference. But I argue that the conference had far-reaching impact on Africa, politically, economically, and socially.
Well, of course, the Africans themselves weren't consulted about it to begin with, but tell us a bit more about how decisions made then still influence Africa and are problematic in some cases in Africa.
Well, for example, after the Berlin Conference, European administrations obviously were transplanted to Africa. And a lot of the political systems that currently exist in contemporary Africa are not based out of a kind of natural growth of political systems that existed before, but were effectively imported political systems from either the French system or the British system. Also, you have 16 landlocked countries in Africa now as a result of these political compromises of European imperial powers. And you have many states that are unviable also. They're not really able to be economically viable unless they're linked to larger structures, which is why regional integration is so important for Africa, maybe more so than any other continent. Only 12% of trade is among Africans themselves. So I think that's important. So the way that economically dependent unviable states were created, the fact that there were political systems which did not in any way accord with how people were ruling themselves, and conflict resolution mechanisms that, for example, existed in traditional African structures were also destroyed. So those are, I would say, some of the legacies of Berlin as far as Africa is concerned.
In effect, the Europeans wound up, especially during the period of decolonization, imposing on Africa borders and polities that had nothing to do with what had pre-existed their arrival.
Yes.
And this, I think, still is underestimated today, the trauma of it and also the difficulty of making it work.
Absolutely. I mean, that was why most of the book that I wrote on the curse of Berlin actually focused on the post-Cold War era. But what I tried to do was to show that some of the problems actually have their roots in the way that state formation and state systems were created. But I don't only place the blame on external actors. I also note that African actors in the 50 years after independence have not done much to reverse that blighted legacy, you know, with maybe a few exceptions, because one-party states and military rule were the norm in Africa. You know, between 1960 and 1990, no single party lost an election in Africa, no ruling party. And so it's important also to look at autocratic misrule and corruption and the lack of imagination and ingenuity in forming federations, trade blocs, etc. And that's part of what I also try to look at, both the external and internal dimensions.
Although one positive development in Africa, I find, I returned to Nigeria, by the way, your country, for the first time in 40 years, a few years ago. And I was struck by the fact that nobody was really blaming Europe for anything anymore. Whereas when I was a teenager and my parents were living in Nigeria, the colonial power, the former colonial power, was blamed for everything. So that puts more pressure in a way on African leaders to deal with today's African problems.
Well, you see, I would say that Nigeria is a special case. There are few countries in Africa that I think, despite the colonial legacy, had the chance, because of population, natural resources, and other factors, to actually make a go of creating a modern state that was, you know, well developed. People often note that South Korea and Ghana, and I think probably Nigeria, had around the same size of economy in the 1950s. And I think the problem with Nigeria is that they've seen military leaders and civilians squander something like $380 billion in oil revenues that should have gone to developing the country between 1970 and, say, 2007. And so you have a direct cause of why the infrastructure, for example, that exists in South Africa for all its problems, and the industrialization that exists in South Africa with a third of Nigeria's population, just isn't there in the Nigerian case. And so I think bad leadership and the failure not only to industrialize, but to provide leadership to some extent to the rest of Africa can be blamed on poor leadership.
Well, as a Nigerian, are you encouraged by the recent election that did seem to manifest a degree of public impatience with politics as usual?
Well, I think one mustn't underestimate what just happened in Nigeria. For the first time in 55 years of independence, you've had a democratically elected, or you've had a civilian government, let's say, replaced by another civilian government. It's never happened in Nigeria's history. And I think the message it sends is that performance needs to be linked to some kind of accountability. You know, if you don't perform, you can be thrown out. In the past, ruling parties and governments were always able to manipulate even electoral commissions to stay in power, and the only way to replace them was through military coups. So it sends a very strong message, in my view.
Great. Well, listen, Ade, thank you very much for being with us today. I look forward to a very dynamic debate with our public tonight in Tokyo. And for those of you who join us on video, I commend to you Ade's writing on Africa, which is an extraordinary run. 4 books of his own, 8 edited volumes that he's either edited alone or with others. It's probably an unequaled record amongst a still young scholar in Africa. So it's really a privilege for us to have you with us.
Thank you very much.